Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tezenghausen. Today is November 21st and there will be a lot of news. A peace plan without a ceasefire. Why is the US putting pressure not on Russia but on its own allies? How do they want to give Moscow veto power in NATO? Somehow Putin's ultimatum has turned into an ultimatum for Ukraine. Well, and Russia's facing not only a digital gulag but also something even more serious. A strange statement from Vice President Vance about Russia and Ukraine. Can Putin force NATO countries to leave the alliance? And we'll also talk about another dictatorial regime that has managed so poorly that the capital of Iran is slowly sinking underground because the money was spent on uranium enrichment. All this and more in today's episode. There will be a lot of interesting things. So if you're new to the channel, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. While discussions about the US peace plan are ongoing, Russia is striking residential buildings. They hit Zaporizhzhia yesterday. Unfortunately, at this moment it is known that 5 people have died and 8 have been injured. My condolences to those who have lost loved ones, and I wish a speedy recovery to those who were injured. Odessa has been under attack by strike drones since last night, and they are still coming, continuing to fly in. Well, Putin has only one tool for forcing peace. Unfortunately, lately he has found some helpers. And the European Union, having recovered from the shock, is preparing its own plan to end the war, one that is more favorable for Ukraine. This is reported by the Wall Street Journal. European leaders want to agree on it in the coming days. As far as I understand, an emergency meeting is scheduled for tomorrow, and they are persuading Ukraine to support this particular plan. They consider the American plan, and in the European Union as well, the Donald Trump plan to be, in fact, a capitulation of Ukraine. But here our European partners have put it very diplomatically. Judging by the structure of the document that the United States provided to Ukraine, it appears that not only Ukraine but in fact NATO and the European Union are expected to capitulate. Let me explain why. Here are a few points out of the 28 that have left experienced politicians in Europe, to put it mildly, puzzled and shocked. A subtle point. First of all, in this document, Europe is not a subject. In other words, Europe is mentioned as an object of Russian guarantees. Russia will not attack Europe. Europe is seen as a wallet, 100 billion plus for the reconstruction fund. And in no way as a subject that signs or controls anything. Plus, in fact, in 3 points, Russia is given the right to veto NATO policy. And at this point, we've really hit rock bottom. That is points 3, 7, and 8. NATO stops further expansion. A provision is added to the NATO Charter that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. And another point, NATO commits not to deploy troops in Ukraine. This is not just Ukraine refusing NATO, this is an attempt to write internal NATO rules for Russia according to Moscow's demands. This is what the Kremlin has been striving for since the 1990s. An external political limit for NATO, legally formalized at the initiative of the United States. So the wording, by the way, not to expand further, can naturally be used as an argument against future formats, for example with Moldova or Georgia. In this case, Russia, even from its sanctioned position as a raw materials vassal of China, is influencing the policies of other countries and their decisions to join or not join NATO. It's just unbelievable. It is forbidden to fire at Moscow or St. Petersburg. That's a separate point altogether. If Ukraine launches a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause, there are no guarantees. They will be annulled. This isn't just about the 2 cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. This is really about a psychological shield over the capital, over the decision-making centers in Russia, and a signal to Western arms manufacturers that any weapon capable of reaching Moscow, and let me remind you, it's only 500 kilometers from the border, automatically falls under this restriction. Into the zone, God forbid, don't give it to Ukraine, who knows where and when it might be fired. That's it, the guarantees will be annulled. And then there's the economic part, which is just absolutely beautiful, right? But really, who exactly is going to profit off of Ukrainian blood in this situation? About the future US-Russia axis as business partners. So there's a long list of joint US-Russia projects. Energy, natural resources, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, data centers, rare earth materials, projects in the Arctic, and so on. Russia's return to the G8 and the gradual lifting of sanctions, individually and step by step. And do you know what's happening? The merging of US and Russian elites who will then put pressure on any Ukrainian government. Doesn't matter if it's the current one or the next, and on Europe as well. Like, don't rock the boat. Our rat in Russia is feeling sick. Don't rock the boat. We have a joint fund here, the G8 projects in the Arctic. Don't ruin our profits. Turns out Europe is paying too, but it doesn't influence anything. Honestly, it's a humiliating arrangement. Unfreeze the assets of the Russian Federation, if you please. As I already mentioned, 100 billion is added to the fund. It takes on part of the political responsibility for Russia not attacking Europe. So basically, Europe is the cashier and the observer. For Moscow, this is simply the perfect scenario, just absolutely perfect. Europe, dependent on Washington's decisions, weakened and deprived of its own voice. That's why European leaders were so outraged. Well, that's just it. And then there's the amnesty, which is a whole separate story. Forget about Bucha, forget about Irpin, forget about Mariupol, forget about the drama theater with the word children written on the roof where the Russians dropped an aerial bomb, forget about the mass deportations of children, forget about everything. You know, amnesty in this war, if we look at the long term, this really undermines the entire idea of responsibility and accountability for aggression, as well as the principles of international law. In other words, you can do whatever you want, you can commit genocide against an entire people, you can steal 20,000 children, you can get an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for it, but in the end, a kind uncle will come along. And he'll say, let's just wipe all this away. You're not guilty of anything. Your hands, you're already covered in blood up to your bald crown. But that's okay. We'll clean you up, wash you off, and start trading with you. And all those hundreds of thousands killed, forget about them. That's not your problem. Well, it's just that simple. Well, based on this point, and really based on all these points, the US is indeed acting from a position of strength, but not towards Russia, but primarily towards Europe, obviously towards Ukraine, NATO, the G7, the International Criminal Court, international law, and the countries that have the prospect of sheltering under the NATO umbrella so that this inadequate Baldy doesn't come after them. By the way, I'd also like to draw your attention to something. In all these 28 points, subpoints, and so on, there is no first and key point, the one you could basically start with. A ceasefire. Naturally, this point primarily concerns Russia, since Ukraine has repeatedly stated that it is ready to cease fire at any moment, even right now. And Donald Trump has stated, well, let's put it this way, Donald Trump, as of this summer, stated that a ceasefire is needed. I don't know what this version of Donald Trump is saying now. So here I am reading this news and asking, where is this point at all? And I read this news. The US is ready to impose new sanctions against Russia and will continue supplying weapons to Kyiv if it believes that Moscow is not responding properly to Washington's calls for a ceasefire in Ukraine and to negotiate an end to the war. This was stated by the US Permanent Representative to the UN, Mike Waltz, at a Security Council meeting. It's amazing how Mr. Witkoff, when drafting this plan with Putin's special envoy Dmitriev, missed this point. How could that happen? It's simple. At the very least, include a ban on drone strikes on Ukrainian territory and missile strikes deep into the country. I mean, there was such an option. Remember? An air truce or whatever it was called. Then there wouldn't have been such a tragedy as the one that happened recently in Ternopil. Just think about it. A Russian missile struck an apartment building and, according to the latest updated data, killed 31 people, including 6 children. 94 people were injured, 18 of them children. A single Russian missile. But this plan doesn't exist. This point isn't there. Not to strike Ukrainian territory with missiles and drones. Do you know why this point isn't there? Because attacks on residential buildings, hospitals, energy facilities, and other civilian infrastructure, this is the only way Putin has left to put pressure on Ukraine. hit Ukraine until they agree, and this method was left to him in such a cynical way. And now the news just keeps coming one after another. The US expects Zelensky to sign the American plan to end the war by Thanksgiving, November 27th, according to the Financial Times. I think he won't sign it. They'll only talk to Donald Trump next week. They'll be calling Donald Trump next week. Well, it's unlikely, very unlikely. It's basically just all of Russia's demands, and they're even written out in detail by Mr. Witkoff himself. And I'm still very curious, what about Donald Trump, the so-called summer-fall model? What about his ultimatum to Putin? At first it was a 50-day ultimatum then. He shortened it to 10 days. Impressive. At the time we all said, wow. So, what happened to that version of Donald Trump, and how did that ultimatum to Putin turn into an ultimatum to Ukraine? What actually happened? So, friends, let me remind you, despite the fact that some plans are being proposed to Ukraine right now, whether they'll be agreed upon or not, and there will also be a European plan, the war is ongoing and Putin is doing everything possible to seize as much Ukrainian land as he can and to kill as many Ukrainians as possible. But the Ukrainians have become a thorn in his side. And Ukraine is the very nail that will seal the lid of his black coffin and bury him forever. That's why the Ukrainians, who are now holding back this massive Russian orc army, are heroes, true heroes. And we have several fundraising campaigns, and I decided to mix them together somehow because I want to help everyone. Today, our fundraiser is for repairing equipment for the legendary Freedom of Russia Legion, which is fighting for Ukraine. A lot of their equipment has been damaged recently and needs repairs, but believe me, the Legionnaires use this equipment to destroy bad Russians, because as it turns out, there are also good ones. Let me remind you, both the Freedom of Russia Legion and the RDK, these are fighters with Russian passports who are fighting for Ukraine. So for the legendary Legion, I ask you to help with the fundraiser. And by the way, the Legionnaires and Caesar have recorded a message for us and for you. Please take a look.
Честь имею. Мы, бойцы Легиона Свобода России, обращаемся к зрителям канала Бориса Тизенгаузена. На фронте машина – это жизнь. Это наш шанс добраться до своих, подвести боеприпасы и эвакуировать раненых. Но каждый день мы теряем машину из-за дронов, обстрелов и мин. Сейчас нам нужны средства, чтобы наши колеса снова крутились. Каждый донат – это шанс выжить и бороться дальше. За свободу, за правду.
Let's help the Legionnaires. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There's Mono, Private, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. And yes, there are many different ways, so you can choose the one that's most convenient for you. And thank you so much really to everyone who is helping Ukraine in such a difficult time for our country. Thank you so much. And there's one more piece of news I came across, so they decided to celebrate a bit. Since they rolled out such a document, they thought they'd take the opportunity to mess with the dictators a little less in their joy. In recent episodes, I mentioned Lukashenko, saying that it's probably not in his interest for saboteurs to cross from his territory into Poland, blow up railway tracks, and so on. But even if Lukashenko might not have had full control over that, the expired Dranik is up to his old tricks again. Lithuania is just at its wit's end now. Once again, balloons carrying smuggled cigarettes have arrived. And not only have they arrived, but because of these balloons, weather probes with blocks of smuggled Belarusian cigarettes attached, they are flying over into Lithuania. So because of these balloons, the plane carrying the Lithuanian foreign minister and the EU commissioner couldn't land in the Lithuanian capital. Can you imagine? Belarus continues its hybrid attacks against Lithuania and the European Union, further escalating the situation. Well, in general, I think Lukashenko has already received his final warning. Soon he will face some very unpleasant sanctions. Of course, Lukashenko claims that it's not him, that actually it's citizens of Lithuania come to Belarus, buy cigarettes, and then for some unclear reason, launch balloons somewhere over their own airports. In general, as always, nothing he says makes sense. It's illogical. He loves to lie, he has to lie, but he will still have to answer for it. Even if someone now decides that some sanctions might be lifted from Putin or that he might get some kind of amnesty, international law has not been cancelled and neither has karma. The Ukrainian Mossad hasn't been cancelled either. By the way, I think that's where most of the hope lies. That when the balding hat comes out onto a balcony somewhere in Valdai or wherever and says, "Oh, I've defeated everyone," some little mechanical bird, perhaps a tiny automaton, will eventually fly right into his balding head, and when that happens, that'll be the end of it, just like that. Now, here's another interesting clarification for you to consider. The United States peace plan, as it currently stands, offers Ukraine a comprehensive 10-year security guarantee, which is based on NATO's well-known Article 5 principle, the collective defense clause that states an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. Axios is reporting this now. According to the draft, and here every detail is very important, any future significant, deliberate and prolonged armed attack by Russia on Ukraine will be considered an attack that threatens peace and security of the transatlantic community, the US, their allies, and all of them will respond in an appropriate manner, including the use of military force. So significant, deliberate. What are the criteria here? Does it mean 1 million Russians have to come in? Deliberate? Lukashenko recently said, well, it wasn't deliberate, we didn't know about it. If Putin says, we just wandered in by accident, that's all, would that be considered deliberate or not? A prolonged armed attack? How many years, how many months? So the guarantees here are so strong, it's almost overwhelming. Well, to begin with, honestly, after this war, the UN should just be dissolved, the Organization of Concerned Nations, and in its place, a truly effective organization should be created. Not this crowd of tens of thousands of officials who have no idea how to stop a war in the modern world, how to impose sanctions if Russia is involved, how to pass resolutions if Russia has veto power. By the way, China also has veto power. Tomorrow, China enters Taiwan, and that's it. The UN is also powerless because China has veto power. Regarding security guarantees, let me read you 2 interesting points, and you try to guess where they're from. Point 1. Respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. The Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America confirm to Ukraine that they respect its independence, its sovereignty, and its existing borders. That's point 1. Point 2. Non-aggression. The same Russia, the United Kingdom, and the USA undertake obligations to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine, except in cases of self-defense. This, well, I think many of you have guessed, is me reading the first and second points of the Budapest Memorandum. And you know what I don't quite understand? That when it seems like Putin is running out of steam, when the sanctions really start to work, China and India are reducing their purchases of Russian oil. Putin has no obvious successes on the front lines. And the economy is clearly not doing well. He's got a deficit approaching 10 trillion. At this moment, when Donald Trump himself says that his economy is just doing badly, it's just bad. And at this very moment, for some reason, someone decides to give Putin some royal gifts. As if he were the victor in this war. He's not winning, Putin will never win. So where does this unprecedented generosity come from? Oh, and friends, I remind you every time, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It really matters, and it helps promote the channel and the information we're sharing from Ukraine. It's clear that Russia is spending colossal amounts of money on propaganda, but no matter how much they spend, they won't be able to silence us. So subscribe. Soon, by the way, YouTube will be shut down in Russia. Despite the fact that they're trying to pull Putin out of the swamp to save what normal people would call his reputation, it's obvious what will happen. It's all pretty clear, probably, yes, that this will be the first defeat. I mean, it's obvious to many that the processes inside Russia after the end of this war will just be fucked up. Well, if not catastrophic, then very, very painful for Russia. An economic crisis, a political crisis, and hundreds of thousands of thugs who will return from the war. All of this requires the strictest additional control so that Russia doesn't just tear itself apart from the inside, so that this pot of cabbage soup, whose lid they're tightening down so nothing escapes, doesn't eventually explode all over the filthy Russian kitchen. To begin with, of course, they are taking control of all information. That's what's happening right now. Websites are being shut down, there are whitelists of certain sites, and they're testing disconnecting the Russian internet from the global internet. And interesting reports are coming out about how all of this will be brought under control in Russia. So it's not just going to be whitelists and a digital gulag, it's going to be much more serious than that. That is, first of all, they plan to criminalize any communication not controlled by the security forces. What does that mean? If tomorrow they say that now all of Russia must communicate only through the national messenger Max, then that's it. WhatsApp or anything else will be considered hostile, and messaging through those apps will be a criminal offense. That's what criminalization means. They've already introduced this. They have it. The introduction of facial recognition systems. And here's something else they want to do. Launch monitoring of citizens' spending. By 2028, this could finally take shape as an autocratic system modeled after Turkmenistan. By the way, Putin could actually learn from their experience. Or North Korea. They have their own unique, encapsulated and highly restricted internet system called Kwangmyong, which is completely separate from the global internet. And not just to ban or block access to alternative sources of information, or any information that has not been specifically approved by the state authorities, but also to introduce and enforce strict monitoring and surveillance of citizens' spending habits, purchases, and financial transactions. Now they're running around with their digital ruble, biometrics, the collection of biometric and behavioral data. They already have that. So now with the digital ruble, they will essentially introduce programmable money, meaning that Russians will only be able to spend it on designated purposes. Here's your salary, so here are your digital funds, and you can only spend them on entertainment, for example. You can pay on these kinds of websites, but not on those, and so on. They'll have all of this soon. So, yes. And the strange statement from Vice President Vance just shocked me, to be honest. So it goes like this. Why don't Russians and Ukrainians, instead of killing each other, start trading, visiting each other's countries, and engaging in various cultural exchanges, said Vice President Vance. Let me put it more clearly now. Why shouldn't the relatives of those who died in the September 11th attacks become friends with Osama bin Laden, with Al-Qaeda? I don't know. Maybe they could trade, visit each other's countries, and engage in various cultural exchanges. Imagine for a second that in Ukraine, September 11th happens every day, and this has been going on for 4 years now. In the September 11th attack, about 3,000 people died. According to Donald Trump, about 1,000 people die every day in this war. So just imagine, every 3 days, Ukraine suffers casualties equivalent to those of September 11th. And this has been going on for 4 years now. Yes, and as for visiting each other's countries, well, they came to us in tanks across the border, visiting the country. Why, by the way, didn't Americans go to Japan to trade or do some cultural after Pearl Harbor? Why didn't they just do exchanges? Why did they drop atomic bombs instead? Can you tell me? I mean, how can the Vice President of the US be reasoning at the level of Dora the Explorer? That's what this show is called in our country. The children's version is known as Dasha the Traveler. Seriously, all that's missing is that little monkey, what's his name, Boots, and the squirrel Tico, and then the vice president and the wreath will all be discussing together why Ukrainians don't want to be friends with Russians. But before the full-scale invasion, they were friends. They visited each other, so what happened? And by the way, how should we deal with this? It's interesting. Putin stated that all his objectives must be achieved, no exceptions. And you know, one of the main goals of the Russian Federation was that NATO must stop expanding and return to the borders of 1997. Ryabkov said this, and Putin said it on December 21st, 2021. We need legal guarantees. NATO must leave the territories it entered after 1997. And what will happen to us tomorrow? Mr. Witkoff will bring an ultimatum of 28 points for the Baltic countries and say, well, that's how it is, you see? Who will be given an ultimatum next? And so in the end, with this lack of understanding of priorities of these regimes, today I came across some news, just so you understand, that there's supposedly an economic crisis, a collapse. The population in Russia will return to the swamps, will eat birch bark, roots, I don't know, survive on moss. It's all complete nonsense. They will still come to fight anyway. The president of Iran stated that the capital will have to be moved from Tehran due to overpopulation and a severe water shortage. You might wonder, how are these news stories connected? Let's find out. The infrastructure of the metropolis can't handle the load, and at the same time there is no budget for relocation, but this is the kind of crisis they have. Iran, which has been under sanctions for a long time, instead of providing its capital with water, pumped out all the water from underground aquifers. Everything they could, they took, and kept ignoring the problem. There was always money for missiles, for Shaheds, for proxies. Hezbollah, Hamas, Ansar Allah, and so on. Groups in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. There was money for all that, billions for it, but to bring water, to set up a water supply for Iran's capital, there wasn't. There is no money for that. And by the way, this is the answer to the question of why Russia hasn't built a water pipeline to the occupied Donbas in 12 years. And will they ever restore anything there at all? No one is going to restore anything. War. War and more war. Threats to everyone else, an arms race, war, war, war. When the population starts to do something, they're sent off to die in yet another war. In other words, if this filth isn't crushed now, it will come with war anyway. And if you give him now what he wants and even the right to decide who gets into NATO and who doesn't, he will come. To the Baltic countries, he will definitely come. The question is different. For example, in the United States, one president leaves, another comes in, and it's unclear how he will view this. Maybe he's one of those old school types who don't stand on ceremony with people like Putin. Maybe. But they will spend their last money on uranium enrichment, building their Sarmats, Burevestniks, Poseidons. That's how their regimes exist. That's what keeps them going. You just knock that little stool out from under their feet and the regimes collapse. If Hitler were alive now, I think he'd be thinking how unlucky I was with my opponents back then. If things had been like they are now, he would have already been standing outside Moscow and everyone would be negotiating with him. He would be handing out natural resources from the territories he had captured in exchange. He would be offering gold from the banks of the occupied countries. Everyone would want to trade with him and would be happily doing business with him. And they would have left him all the plundered, occupied lands. And no one would even mention a second front. But friends, nevertheless. Ukraine has shown the whole world the true face of so-called Great Russia and its great, bald, 1.5-meter-tall conqueror. Yes, right now they're trying with all their might to pull him out of this swamp. What a disgrace. A superpower is dragging this bold scoundrel out of the swamp and preserving his Botoxed mask. But believe me, the processes that will come to Russia after this war will finish it off. Ukraine will be, as they say, Ukraine will sing the funeral song for the Russian Federation as it exists now. So take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and subscribe to this channel. And let's help the Legionnaires and Caesar. They're fighting right now in one of the hottest spots. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. Wishing us all a peaceful day, and glory to Ukraine.